Welcome back to the Religious Studies Podcast, everyone. We're diving into some seriously fascinating stuff today.
Yeah, we're going to get deep.
Real deep. And just a quick reminder, this podcast is AI generated, but don't worry, every single fact is checked by our researcher, Bastian Fribourg.
It keeps us honest.
He does. So today, we're diving headfirst into Scientology, and we're going to be looking specifically at how its views on gender roles kind of bump up against modernity. You might think of Scientology as a modern religion, but its views on gender, well, they take a pretty interesting turn towards the traditional.
Yeah, it's a real paradox, and we'll be unpacking it all through the lens of some research done by Peter B. Anderson from the University of Copenhagen. His work really highlights this tension.
All right, so before we get too far into it, let's do a super quick Scientology 101, like back to basics. We're talking 1950s, growing out of L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetics movement. It was all about, like, debugging the human mind, right? Like addressing those anxieties of modern life.
Right. Hubbard's early work was all about what he called drive reduction, which basically means trying to ease the suffering that these drives caused. But as Scientology kind of evolved and moved forward, the focus shifted away from individual anxieties and more toward this big idea of survival. On multiple levels, too. We're talking personal survival, the survival of the group, mankind, even the spiritual being itself.
So it went from fix yourself to save everyone, including the universe.
Okay.
So that's pretty ambitious.
Very.
And this is where those 8 dynamics of survival come in, right?
Yeah, each dynamic represents a level of existence and the drive to survive at that level.
Okay, I see. So we have Scientology, this seemingly modern religion that's all about tackling modern anxieties. But now let's bring in this other concept, homomodernity. So what does homomodernity even mean in this context?
So it's a term that's used to describe a sort of counter-movement within modernity itself. While modernity is often associated with more fluid, less defined gender roles, what the research refers to as plastic sexuality, homomodernity kind of pushes back against that. It's about reinforcing those traditional, often stricter boundaries around gender and sexuality.
So it's like modernity is trying to loosen things up, and then homomodernity comes along and says, nope, we're sticking to the old rules.
In a way, yeah. And what's so interesting is that Scientology, despite, coming out of 20th century modernity, seems to align more with this homo-modern tendency when it comes to gender roles.
Yeah, I'm starting to get the sense that there's more to this story.
Oh, absolutely. While Scientology's stance on gender might seem pretty straightforward at first glance, there are nuances and even contradictions that we need to kind of dig into. For example, there are women in leadership positions within the organization. That definitely challenges the idea of a purely traditional patriarchal structure, right?
Okay, now I'm really interested. So we have this puzzle. Scientology is a product of modernity, yet seemingly embraces more traditional gender roles, but also have women in leadership positions. Where do we even go from here?
To really understand this, we need to dive into the specifics of Scientology's teachings and practices, and also look at the influence of L. Ron Hubbard himself. His personal experiences and views played a huge role in shaping the movement's perspective on gender and relationships.
So let's start with Hubbard then. The research mentions his, fascination with psychoanalysis, but also his rejection of Freudian psychology. So how did that play into Scientology's view of gender?
That's a great question. Hubbard was super interested in, the inner workings of the mind, but he disagreed with Freud's emphasis on sexuality as the main driving force, Instead, he focused more on what he saw as the spiritual dimension of human existence. This shift away from a Freudian perspective had some major implications for how he viewed gender roles and relationships.
So less about those primal urges and more about, spiritual evolution.
Exactly. For Hubbard, spiritual growth, what he called clearing, became the ultimate goal, right? And within that framework, traditional gender roles, a clear division of responsibilities within the family, were seen as helpful to stability and therefore spiritual progress.
So it's like a back-to-basics approach to family in order to achieve these higher spiritual goals.
Right.
Okay, that's interesting. So how did these ideas actually show up in Scientology's teachings? Are we talking strict rules about how men and women should behave?
Well, let's take a look at a specific example mentioned in the research, the Ekteskap og Help course. This course, which translates to marriage and help, gives us a glimpse into how Scientology presents traditional gender roles, in action.
Okay, I'm all ears. What does this course advocate?
Well, one example from the course describes a situation where a wife is experiencing anxiety and the solution. The husband should address her anxieties by providing material comfort and affection. It kind of reinforces that traditional stereotype of the man as provider and protector.
Yeah, very traditional gender roles in action. But wait, didn't you say earlier that there were contradictions within Scientology's approach to gender? I mean, this seems pretty cut and dry.
You're totally right to point that out. And here's where things get even more interesting. Because while Scientology promotes these traditional ideals in its teachings, Hubbard himself sometimes seemed to backtrack or contradict his own earlier statements. For instance, he once said that it was never his intention to regulate the private lives of individuals.
Really? That seems to clash pretty strongly with the rigid gender roles we're seeing.
Exactly. And the research suggests that Hubbard's later comments might have been an attempt to distance himself from controversy and accusations of promoting restrictive gender roles.
Ah, so a bit of damage control maybe, trying to soften the image a bit.
Possibly. It really just highlights the complexity of Scientology's relationship with gender roles because alongside these like traditional teachings and Hubbard's sometimes conflicting statements, you also have women holding these prominent leadership positions within the organization.
This is fascinating. It really feels like we're peeling back the layers of an onion here, and each layer just gets more and more intriguing. I have a feeling we've only scratched the surface.
Oh, you're absolutely right. We've laid the groundwork, but there's so much more to uncover, especially the role of women in leadership within Scientology and how that intersects with these seemingly traditional views on gender. That's where we'll pick up in our next segment.
So just to recap, we've established that Scientology really does seem to promote these traditional gender roles, like within their doctrine and practices.
Yeah.
But we also have this interesting piece of the puzzle where women hold positions of power in the organization.
Right. It's like these two pieces don't really fit.
Yeah.
You have this emphasis on women fulfilling these traditional roles in the family, and then boom, you have women leading aspects of the whole religion.
It's contradictory.
Yeah.
So, like, how do we even reconcile these two seemingly opposing elements? Is it possible that the presence of women in leadership is, like, more symbolic, while the actual power dynamics are still mostly patriarchal?
That's a good point, and it's something that Anderson's research points to as well. Despite the visibility of women in leadership roles, the overall framework of Scientology, as shaped by, Hubbard's teachings and the organization's structure, still leans toward a traditionally patriarchal model.
It's like this underlying structure that, even with some cracks, still holds on to those traditional views.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like the presence of women in leadership kind of acts as a counterpoint to accusations of sexism or strict gender roles, while the underlying foundation of the belief system remains largely unchanged.
Okay, so we've got this complex interplay between traditional doctrine, women in leadership, and Hubbard's, sometimes contradictory statements. It's a fascinating puzzle, but kind of messy. What's the research's overall takeaway from all of this?
Well, the research argues that Scientology, even though it's a product of modernity and presents itself that way, exhibits strong leanings toward what we've been calling homo-modernity.
Meaning that despite its modern origin story, it ultimately embraces these more traditional and rigid views on gender.
Exactly. And the research even suggests that this might be, at least in part, intentional. It's possible that Scientology purposely cultivates this image of like traditional family values and clear-cut gender roles as a way to kind of differentiate itself from what it sees as the excesses or moral decay of modern society.
So almost like a marketing tactic,
Mm.
positioning themselves as the stable alternative in a world they see as increasingly chaotic.
That's one way to put it. And it definitely aligns with Scientology's focus on achieving order and stability, both within the individual and society as a whole.
Okay, so where does that leave us? We've uncovered all these seemingly contradictory elements within Scientology, traditional gender roles, women in leadership, and Hubbard's kind of shifting stances. What's the big, takeaway here?
The key takeaway, I think, is that religious organizations, particularly new religious movements like Scientology, are rarely simple or straightforward. They evolve over time, they adapt to changing social contexts, and often grapple with these internal contradictions. And to really understand these complexities, we need to look beyond those surface-level observations and really dig into the nuances of their teachings, practices, and leadership structures.
So it's not enough to just label Scientology as modern or traditional. There's more going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. And I think this deep dive has shown us that exploring those deeper layers can reveal some fascinating insights into how a religion interacts with those, bigger societal trends, even those it might seem to reject, at least on the surface.
This has been really insightful. It's amazing how much we can learn from looking closely at something like gender roles within a religious organization. It really speaks to those broader complexities of religious belief and practice.
For sure. And I think one of the coolest things about studying new religious movements is that you get to observe those dynamics in real time as they unfold and adapt within, a rapidly changing world.
Okay, I have to ask, what about the argument that Scientology is a product of modernity itself? Doesn't that clash with this whole idea that it embraces more traditional views?
That's a great point, and it brings us back to this concept of homo modernity. Because remember, homo modernity isn't a complete rejection of modernity, it's more like a selective embrace.
So they're picking and choosing what parts of modernity to accept and which to reject.
Exactly. And with Scientology, it seems like they've embraced the technological advancements and those organizational structures of modernity, while also clinging to more traditional notions of gender roles and family values.
Fascinating. So it's not this simple binary of modern versus traditional. It's more about how these different elements intersect and influence each other.
Precisely. And that's what makes studying these new religious movements like Scientology so compelling. They really challenge our preconceived notions and force us to think critically about that ever-evolving relationship between religion, culture, and society.
This has been such an incredible journey through the complexities of Scientology's views on gender roles and their relationship to modernity. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on this often misunderstood religion.
I'm glad to hear that. And I hope this deep dive has encouraged you to keep exploring the world of religious studies.
Well, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive into Scientology's views on gender roles, I wanted to touch upon those specific examples the research gives about their organizational structure in Denmark.
Oh, yeah, that's a key element in understanding this whole complicated dynamic. What's particularly interesting is that snapshot the research provides of Scientology's leadership in Denmark. It's kind of wild to see how many of those top positions are held by women.
That is remarkable, considering the traditional gender roles we've been talking about. What kind of positions are we talking about?
Well, for instance, the Continental Liaison Office, which is a pretty key position within the Danish branch of Scientology, was held by a woman. And similarly, the leadership of New Era Publications, which handles, the printing and distribution of Scientology materials across Europe, Africa, and Asia, that's also in the hands of a woman.
So, not minor roles. These are influential positions within the organization. That definitely makes that narrative of rigid, male-dominated leadership a bit more complicated.
For sure. It suggests there's a more nuanced reality at play than we might assume based just on Scientology's doctrinal emphasis on traditional gender roles.
It seems like we need to dig a little deeper into how Scientology frames itself in the context of those modern anxieties and see how that connects to its views on traditional gender roles. That's where we'll pick up in the next segment. All right, so welcome back to the Religious Studies podcast. In case you just tuned in, we're taking a deep dive into Scientology, trying to figure out how their views on gender roles kind of fit in with modernity. In the last couple of segments, we talked about some of the basic ideas of Scientology, the influence of L. Ron Hubbard, and even looked at how things are structured in Denmark. Now, I think it's time to zoom in on how Scientology presents itself in the context of modern anxieties.
Yeah, that's a good direction to go in. The research we've been talking about suggests that Scientology positions itself as a kind of solution to the anxieties of modern life, especially anxieties related to relationships and sexuality.
Right, and we've already touched on how they seem to offer those traditional gender roles and family structures as like an answer.
Mm.
But it's really interesting that instead of embracing the fluidity that often comes with modern approaches to those issues, they've got this structured path that's rooted in, those traditional values. It's like they're saying, hey, is modernity freaking you out? Well, here's a good old-fashioned family structure for you.
Exactly. It's all about providing a sense of order and stability, especially in a world they see as chaotic. This appeal to tradition can be pretty attractive, especially when things are changing so fast and people are looking for something solid to hold on to.
Makes sense. Kind of like tapping into this nostalgia for a, simpler time, even if those times weren't really all that simple for everyone.
Right, and it's important to remember that this whole idea of appealing to tradition isn't unique to Scientology. Lots of movements throughout history have done this, framing themselves as like a return to core values in response to what they see as societal decline.
So Scientology's take on this isn't exactly brand new, but they've definitely given it their own flavor. But I'm still kind of wrestling with this whole contradiction. If they're all about those traditional views on gender, how do we explain the women in leadership positions within the organization, those women who are really successful too?
It's a great question, and one that people who study Scientology debate all the time. One idea is that the presence of women in leadership is partly a strategic move. Like, they're trying to counter accusations of sexism and, project a more inclusive image.
So some PR maneuvering.
Maybe. But it's important to remember that women's experiences within Scientology are diverse and complex. Some might find a lot of fulfillment in those traditional roles, while others might find their own way to navigate those roles, carving out their own spaces for agency and leadership.
So not a one-size-fits-all situation. There's variation. And we can't just lump all women in Scientology together and assume they're having the same experience.
Exactly. And that's why we need more research that really listens to women within Scientology and what they have to say. We can't just make simple interpretations. We have to look deeper and see how individuals reconcile their beliefs, identities, and roles within Scientology.
This whole deep dive has been super eye-opening. It's incredible how much we can learn from just looking at something like gender roles within a religious organization. It really shows you how complicated and nuanced religious belief and practice can be.
Yeah, and that's what makes studying these new religious movements so fascinating. They challenge our assumptions and make us think critically about how religion, culture, and society are always interacting and changing.
Well, I think it's time to wrap up our look at modernity, gender roles, and Scientology. It's been a wild ride. I hope our listeners found it interesting and thought-provoking.
And like always, the conversation doesn't end here. We hope you'll keep exploring these topics, questioning assumptions, and looking for different perspectives. Understanding is a journey, and there's always more to discover.
Well said. And with that, we'll say goodbye for today. Thanks for listening to the Religious Studies Podcast, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the amazing world of religion.